On behalf of Just Solutions and our esteemed panel of guest experts, I want to welcome everyone to what I think we'd all agree is a timely and urgent conversation about the CCUS build-out in the Gulf Coast region, CCUS being carbon capture, utilization, and storage. Um, and what this means for our environment, our ecosystems, our communities, and ultimately what this means for the fight for environmental and climate justice in the region and nationally as well. I'm not going to take a lot of time here at the outset. We're going to hear first from Scott Eustace, who is the Community Science Director for Healthy Gulf, and just a font of information and knowledge and wisdom about so many things having to do with the environment in the Gulf Coast region. It's a pleasure and honor to have him here with us today. Second, we'll hear from Caitlin Joshua, who's the lead campaigner for the Gulf Coast region for Earthworks and knows a hell of a lot about what the fight is like on the ground, the organizing battles, and it's great to have her here in our discussion today. And then we'll hear from Annika June, who's a senior analyst with the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis, and also a font of information about project finance and economics and market development of these false solutions, including a lot of what goes on under the name of CCUS in the Gulf Coast region. I want to leave a lot of time for conversation at the end, so I'm just going to turn it right over to Scott Eustace, who will kick us off.
Excellent. Thanks, Lou. And I promise I'll keep it to 15. Apologies if it's a lot of information densely given, but we have 53 injection projects in a state, Louisiana, that has a problem with underground injection control. Why are we, if we're doing CCS, why are we doing it in a state where there's so much wetland impact, environmental impact, and so many maintenance issues with oil and gas wells in general? I think it should cause you to question this technology. This is OxyChem's class 3 failure in a town called Bayou Corn, which, not only did it destroy wetlands, but the town of Bayou Corn is no longer inhabitable by human beings because of the loss of underground injection control. And if you were living in Bayou Corn, now you've got methane gas bubbling underneath your driveway. So if you're still considering this a climate solution, I would advise you, let's get our head out of the clouds and join me in the mud. The policy ask is for a programmatic EIS from the United States Corps of Engineers. It's a hard row to hoe in 2025, but that would make sense in order to evaluate this cumulative wetland impact. There's a lot of risks for doing these high pressure acid injection projects. I'm going to focus on borehole risks, the existing oil well. I was not going to talk about drinking water today, and talk about this pipeline scramble. We have geology in Louisiana, but then a lot of these sites are unsuitable because of all the old oil wells, which means that all of a sudden applicants are proposing 60-mile pipelines, and you've got environmental justice and safety issues with those. But ultimately, why are we putting these projects in places where the Gulf of Mexico will occupy the site in 20 years? Salt water is very bad for your steel projects. And talk a little bit about air pollution from the new petrochemical plants at the end. So, yeah, again, what is carbon waste injection? It's a slippery fish. We only observe it through mathematical models because it's 7,000 feet under the earth. and those mathematical models still contemplate, this yellow plume. It says, well, it's going to be a mobile plume for 230 years. Like, what kind of project management do you know that lasts 230 years? We also have another volume. It's not just the yellow into the blue. When your CO2 is highly compressible, but that blue is not. So it's going to push the salt water 7,000 feet. It's going to push it around on the earth, cause earthquakes, and cause zombie wells like we have in Texas. Meanwhile, why is Louisiana going against Chevron? It's going to the Supreme Court because we have my entire life, 40 years of non-compliance with coastal management and wetlands law in the United States, and Exxon, one of the biggest CCS applicants, has 397 outstanding wetland enforcement cases with the state of Louisiana. So this is Texaco Canal. So this is Chevron's problem pictured, but if you Google Pecan Island, that it's an Exxon oil field that looks just as screwed up as this. So this is a paper about, if you do this high pressure acid injection, it can contaminate your drinking water, it can activate faults, leak through the faults, it can hit old oil wells. And I just added an additional oil well in the lake because in Louisiana, we've got thousands and thousands of unmonitored and broken oil wells that have never been decommissioned. We're in a bit of a decommissioning crisis. And why come to Louisiana? Because we won't have Clean Air Act enforcement. This is happening now in Plaquemines Parish. This is an oil platform. This is a flare that's so broken and corroded that the gas pipeline taking waste gas away from the oil collection site entrains water, and it's shooting water through the methane flare. So we've had some surveys say this is 2,000 kilograms an hour of methane. And why don't we fix this first before we start injecting acid? So if it goes well, if you put an injection array into a wetland site, you're still going to lose a lot of wetlands. This is Exxon and Shell's Sorrento Dome Class 2. So just building the roads and the well pads is going to destroy hundreds of acres of wetlands. To be fair, each of the 53 Class 6 proposals is only 6 wells, so probably smaller than this, but it's still a poor impact on our wetlands. And then what scares me the most is that companies disagree about, is injecting near the old oil wells an important thing or not important thing? Companies are giving two different answers. Air Products, which our petition is on today, is a blue arrow to the right. They are they said, we can only accomplish a CCS project in places that Louisiana has banned oil drilling. Because that's the only place we don't have Swiss cheese in the Caprock, where the LNG applicants in red that the governor is promoting, and there's another DOE project that the governor is promoting. There's hundreds and hundreds of broken oil wells that should be plugged before the project is permitted. So there's shorter pipelines if you don't care about borehole risk. But if you do, like Air Products, that means you've got to put a 60-mile pipeline to get from the new ammonia plant to the injection site in the wetlands. And so this is what it looks like. This was the Shell Maurepas pipeline in 2016, 600 acres of really beautiful, amazing cypress forest destroyed. And this Shell, to save the Convent refinery, and Shell ended up closing that refinery anyway. So this is where Air Products wants to destroy these cypress forests again. And so it's part of why we at least need an environmental impact statement before we industrialize these forests. There's lots of indirect impacts to the hydro period in swamps. I won't bore you with that. We don't have the time. I think people in this are more concerned about, where do you put a pipeline? It comes down to, do you have a real estate attorney? The wetlands do not, and we know in the United States that also marginalized communities don't have the attorneys to yell at the landmen, and so we end up with environmental justice situations where they're building it right now. They're building this pipeline, high pressure, 24-inch CO2 pipeline, 600 feet from folks in Lemonville. And at that distance, people have barely a minute to evacuate an asphyxiating plume if the pipeline were to rupture near them. Exxon itself, they say they can't close it off for 5 minutes, and how you can't even do that's too close because you can't even evacuate situations like this. And yeah, so this is an issue that Exxon, yeah, that's the email to Jeremy. So we're calling for a comment period on this and asking Exxon to cease and desist on that one. Right. And then where are the pipelines coming from? They're coming from new petrochemical plants. And it's interesting, the debates in Louisiana focus on the injection sites and the pipelines. And we haven't talked about CCS enough as air pollution, but I think a sociological analysis like the ones that Beverly Wright initiated in Toxic Wastes and Race at 20, that 2008 paper, kind of shows you maybe why Beverly Wright has said, over 90% of Louisiana power plants are in African American block groups. When we look at 500 petrochemical proposals, it's about 80%, these major ammonia, particulate, and NOx emitters. So it's similarly bad. When you look at pipelines, it's only about 60%. Still, this evaluation, you're trying to get under 50. Is there disparate impact to environmental justice communities, and we don't get below 50? It's still an EJ issue, but you can kind of flip that and see there's more of a white spillover. 40% of the block groups are white, and if you a lot of the motion in the Louisiana legislature and the actions coming from the Louisiana governor are concerned with pipelines and injection. When we, as environmental justice advocates, we also have to remind everyone this is also new particulate and climate pollution into environmental justice areas. So you can help us. Sometimes it feels like we're carrying the weight of the world, but please help us by objecting today or through November 14th to the Air Products blue ammonia proposal. It's a big ammonia plant in Burnside in Ascension Parish, in an environmental justice area, an African American area, an area with a lot of less than documented historic features like cemeteries. It's a large pipeline through our wildlife area that's extremely unsafe to boaters and residents. And also Air Products says it can only inject in the middle of Lake Maurepas, where we have about 200 different commercial harvesters. And it's just unacceptable to industrialize this piece of paradise, especially without an environmental impact statement. So if you can, I'll put a link in the chat. There's a QR code. Please help us by filing an objection to this project.
Scott, so when you're referring to an environmental impact statement, you're referring to a wetlands permit? Because they do
Yes.
already have an air quality permit. Is that correct?
They have one, but my understanding is they're going back again. So we may have other opportunities to object to the air permit. I'm I'm confused about what's
Okay.
happening.
Yeah.
I'm focused on the wetlands and air products on the basis of wetland impact. These 300, 400 acres of, wildlife management area. Air Products promised us an EIS in 2022. They've reneged on that promise. We need to hold them to it. So help us hold them to account. And yeah, so just on the wetlands. But we were also in the core comment period. If you're worried, like, oh, the core is requesting, it always requests that commenters, again, if you're in the United States, you can comment. This is your United States Army Corps of Engineers. They always request comments on everything, including health, safety, and the needs and welfare of the people. So don't be afraid about if your comment concerns health impacts or safety. The Corps is also asking you to email Damon about that too.
Okay.
So
All right. Um, all right, we're gonna turn it over to Caitlin now, who's been fighting this Air Products, of course, scheme all along, and what you're reading on what is going on with CCUS in Ascension Parish.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk about air products for sure. Like that'll be the main thing that I discuss on the call, but
Okay.
we'll certainly touch a couple other things. I say this on every call. Air products is like my baby. I talk about it as much as I talk about it, my own children, and think about the ways in which we can take them down day in and day out. So the story definitely starts with air products for me. That was my first kind of understanding of carbon capture and storage. And I think a lot of organizers can agree and say that October 4 years ago was one of the first times we'd ever heard the term, right? So John Bel Edwards had announced a $4.5 billion industry, coined it as this new wave of green energy provided by blue ammonia. And it was going to be this build out that would certainly bring Louisiana to the forefront when it came to the new energy transfer. And so essentially, folks, at first, like we thought it might be a good thing, right? Like we didn't really know. And it definitely took some time for us to kind of do some education for ourselves first, of course, before we could educate those in the community around what exactly carbon capture and storage is, and the ways in which it has never been proven to work anywhere in the world to scale. And that is kind of where we landed, right? That this was a farce. And ultimately, it took more creation of emissions than just scaling back emissions alone, which was the most mind-blowing piece once we kind of uncovered that this was all for the bottom dollar. So as you can see on the map here, very large, very vast proposed build out starting in Sorrento, Burnside area, where I primarily organize in Ascension Parish, and then of course via pipeline in St. James and St. John would then be transferred into Livingston Tangipahoa Parish, which is where Lake Maurepas is situated here in Louisiana. And so this, for many different reasons, gave us a really big organizing opportunity. We're bringing together 5 parishes to be able to try and stop a massive build out, but also gave us an opportunity to kind of realign the way in which we organize in certain districts with certain people, as this kind of challenged us to figure out what are the ways that we can really have messaging that resonates with folks that don't necessarily engage with other folks on the other side of this facility or other side of this build out. So, kind of starting in 2022 is when we really hit the ground running. Lake Maurepas Preservation Society was formed with a lot of the folks that are involved in Louisiana Against False Solutions, myself included. I got a front row seat to carving out and building out the momentum that was needed to be able to stop this massive facility, this massive CCS proposed project. We saw some success on the local level, right? Like once we did all of that educating and really organizing around what we had found and uncovered with scientists like Scott Eustace, who's on the call today, we realized that this was something that we did not want to get behind. And we certainly needed to make sure that those that were on the lake side, because that was kind of paramount, right? Putting the lake first because they were going to be the ones that had an opportunity to weigh in with the different permit hearings before everyone else. So essentially, organizing Tangipahoa and Livingston Parish was our main priority. We were able to get some resolutions, or they were. I don't want to like take credit for their work. They were, right? The folks in Livingston and Tangipahoa were fired up, ready to go, and wanting to save their lake. A lot of them fish in this lake, Lake Maurepas. spend every weekend there, have, retirement homes there, and plan to live there for, as they say so very proudly, the rest of their lives. And so essentially, they did a good job of engaging, and we supported them in engaging their elected officials. A lot of the elected officials were right there with us, right? Passing resolutions in Tangipahoa and Livingston was two of the first successes that we had with this project. And that happened in summer, fall of 2022. And here's kind of just like an illustration of that. And then in 2023, which was really cool to see in Livingston and Tangipahoa Parish, there was a reinstatement where they extended the carbon capture injection well moratorium for another 120 days. Essentially gave some more time for people to do a little bit more research in the lake, understanding the direct impact of the lake, and then ultimately buying us some time to try and engage other folks on different local and state level governing agencies to be able to carve out the narrative that the people don't want this. So it was very much a delay tactic. And I will make sure everyone has this because I see that was a question in the chat. Again, we were very focused on state level legislation going to the Capitol in 2022, 2023, 2024, and 2025. Whether or not we got our butts handed to us, I will leave that alone, but we certainly tried to make sure that we did whatever we could to bring more bills every single year. So that first year, and I think Scott, feel free to weigh in on this. I think we brought about 2 or 3, and we had maybe 2 or 3 allies with us, and those were legislators that were actually representing the district. So Tangipahoa, St. Helena, Livingston were primarily the voices that you heard at the state capitol. But because they were able to work the room and work the aisle in which they stand, they were able to engage more legislators every single year since we've started bringing these carbon capture and storage bills. And those bills were everything from basically calling out for a flat out moratorium, which in hindsight was an interesting strategy because we were calling for a moratorium in a specific parish, but it's like if there's 5 parishes, so how in the world would you say, okay, you have to have a moratorium in Livingston and Tangipahoa, but what does that leave? Where does that leave St. John, St. James, etc.? So we had to switch it up for the preceding years to make sure that we were bringing back something with a little bit more teeth and most importantly, a little bit more inclusive. From there, we saw a ton of buying of goodwill, right? Air Products was noticing the amount of momentum that we were building on the state and local level, and they responded quickly, and they responded with money. So they donated upwards of $135,000 from Air Products directly to the local government in Livingston Parish. And yes, you're reading that right. And this is just like, y'all, to be very clear, this is just a small bird's eye view of how much money. It's been millions at this point. But earlier this year, I was furious. My sister-in-law gives me a call and she says, oh, she works at Sorrento Primary School in Ascension Parish. And she said, hey, I think we're getting this academy where we're going to transform kids into workforce development and they're going to get an opportunity. It's like, girl, that's Air Products. And she said, okay, you're right. I'm not supposed to like them. And so they've done a really good job of trying to buy goodwill. And then, of course, we've had to do a good job in calling them out and doing so. Last thing I'll mention is there was a $200,000 grant from Air Products to the Lake Maurepas Community Fund. So quite literally, they're donating to the fund that is supposed to be making sure that the lake is well taken care of. And as part of a wildlife management center, that is what they're supposed to be doing. But essentially, the group and the company that we're responsible for completely dilapidating the lake is paying for the lake to be revived, which is wild. And again, this is just kind of a small snapshot of what they've done in terms of millions of dollars at this point. And so this is kind of just a small timeline, kind of all the work that we've had to do, state, local, federal. Now, of course, getting an opportunity to weigh in a couple weeks is going to be really important in our fight. We've done everything, and I won't go over it all because I know I want to watch my time, but everything from, like I said, engaging at the state level, at the local level, making sure that we are engaging with those governing bodies. We took people down to Baton Rouge, and I say down to Baton Rouge, but we're right outside of it, some of us, but down to Baton Rouge to participate in the EPA primacy hearings, which gave folks an opportunity at the 2 years ago in 2023 to come down and say, hey, we do not want Louisiana to be granted primacy, which was another strategic tactic on our part. But of course, right after Christmas, we got a lovely present that we received. EPA allowed for primacy for the state of Louisiana. We were one of the first to do it. I think we're like 3rd in the nation. Essentially, we knew we still had to go back to legislative session, kind of strap our boots even a little tighter and make sure that we had enough legislation to cover us for a few more rounds of legislative sessions. So we did that in the spring of 2024, took hundreds of folks, or brought out hundreds of folks in the fall of 2024, upwards of 300 plus people to the Town of Sorrento Community Center for a hearing specifically regarding the air permit. Fast forward, it was granted in August of 2025, but we are still moving and shaking, doing what we can to prepare people for the upcoming air products hearing on LDNR. It'll be a joint public hearing. LDNR and Army Corps have granted us an opportunity to weigh in St. John Parish. So we're going to bus folks there, do what we can to make sure that we have as many people from all 5 parishes included in those conversations, and most importantly, using their voice at every level, especially during this hearing. And then, of course, for those who want to do public comment as well, we'll make sure that mailers are going out, information is getting to the doors. I actually sound as bad as I do because I was canvassing out in Sorrento. They have got that red dust. It gets me every time with my asthma. So, par for the course. But just to kind of give kind of a contrast to the fight, right? So one of the strategies that we ran, and Rise St. James was really instrumental in doing this, they basically created a press release a few years ago with the help of Earth Justice. Basically, experts raised concern about unmarked graves on the site of the $4.5 billion hydrogen plant, that hydrogen plant being air products in the Burnside, Sorrento area. And this gave all of us that signed on to the press release and the strategy an opportunity to basically say, hey, this is yet another reason that you should not be building on this property. There are unmarked slave grave sites here. Those folks deserve to be acknowledged. And then, of course, their descendants that are still in the area that Rise St. James has identified should be not just communicated with that this is happening, but also given an opportunity to have conservation or preservation status to potentially stop this plant from being built on the property. Governor Landry quickly responded to that strategy in a way that resulted in a harder or some barriers in the way of Rise St. James and being able to move forward with that strategy. But it's my understanding that they're still trying to do what they can, regardless of some of the laws or back and forth banter around what you can and cannot do to stop a facility from coming. Another way that Air Products responded as well, though, y'all, they claim that they have kind of circumvented all the graves, and we know that that's not true. There's still more on that site, but they immediately responded by saying, oh, okay, y'all don't like that we're doing that. We'll just carve them out, right? We'll just make sure that we're going around them, which is just wild. Some interesting things that I'll pull out too, kind of in contrast to what we've seen in some of the predominantly Black areas in St. James and St. John's, who have been kind of sounding the alarm on petrochemical build out for decades, and then also being really forthcoming and transparent with community around how they stand on CCS in particular. Another group that's kind of emerged out of nowhere is Central Louisiana, Vernon and Allen Parish. Essentially, these are folks that technically put Jeff Landry in office. They're super conservative, but also super angry about CCS. And they're fired up and willing to hold anybody accountable to make sure that their voices are heard. They made a lot of strides, but it's my understanding, and I put this on the slide for you guys to kind of see, on September 15th, they kind of got an awakening, if you will, where the Vernon Parish Police Jury did not vote in their favor, but instead stood with industry, deciding that, all of the build out that has been proposed in the area, they will in fact support kind of in a resolution, and also will not be acknowledging any potential legislation such as a moratorium in Vernon Parish. This is just a police juror. I won't speak for the council, et cetera, but just to kind of give an idea of how much like back and forth we're seeing across communities in Southeast and Southwest and Central Louisiana. And then going on here, I know folks are really, really kind of just have the ear to the news here on the recent moratorium that Jeff Landry talked about in his executive order last week. We're still quite honestly unpacking this, y'all. What we've been telling our community members, particularly the ones that I organize in Ascension Parish, is I don't want to say that it means nothing, but essentially for air products and for some of these bigger facilities, Ascension Clean Energy, Hydrogen Complex, et cetera, we have not seen where this is going to make the most impact in terms of scaling back some of those permits or pausing them in any way. So for some of the work that we do with folks here on the call, this is not going to be such an executive order that prevents our work from stalling out. I would love for it to, but he made sure not to include Air Products, Ascension Clean Energy, and a few others across CENLA, Central Louisiana, to basically say like, hey, we're pulling the plug on these, or we're pausing them in terms of rapidly approving their permits. Also wanted to include, again, that Vernon Police Department reverse the outdated resolutions, supports industry regardless of ties to carbon capture. And then, of course, kind of wanted to make sure that we had here from 2022 just some of the kind of what strides we've been able to make in terms of different communities passing things on the local level. Not to say that Governor Landry, again, his executive order on moratorium is mute, but we are certainly still unpacking it and just want to be clear that in this time it doesn't halt our projects, or at least our projects are not halted for those reasons. There was one thing I wanted to include, and I think I failed to put it on a slide. There was also a couple studies that were done around CCS in St. John and St. James. And also an article a wonderful article by The Lens that basically illustrated kind of the fights that we're having in these different communities, kind of the conservative, affluent white fight versus what we're seeing in the predominantly Black communities that are considered progressive, and what that's kind of looked like with the CCS fight in particular, and how it's just been pretty interesting that the governor has responded to the fight from the white folks, the influent folks, those that are super conservative in politics, and those that have been asking him to do something on the state level. Since he's been in office, we've not seen any type of strides or moving of the needle in any way. And the only people that have really saved our fight, honestly, has been EPA in the past, and a few other federal agencies have kind of come to our rescue when it came to trying to slow down a few of these projects, or at least rolling it back. I will say, though, we did make we had one major success, or in my opinion, and Scott, you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, which is my interpretation of a few months ago when LDEQ issued a letter to Air Products basically saying, hey, and I guess maybe I'm contradicting myself, because all of these folks that were in the Ascension Parish area where I organize basically did a great job of engaging local elected officials, state officials, saying they were furious about Air Products. And we believe that influenced LDQ's letter to Air Products saying, hey, you've got to respond to all these hundreds of people that you've ticked off. You haven't told them about safety protocol. You haven't told them about anything in terms of carbon capture and storage and what that could look like in terms of a explosion or a rupture or a leak. And these people are concerned and you should respond. But now that I'm saying it out loud, I don't necessarily think that's because of folks that look like me, if I can be quite candid. But instead, that might be some of the Pelican Point wealthy, affluent folks that have been doing what they can and using their relationships to get it. But I'll give it to us. I see Scott shouting his head, nodding his head, and that it is a win. We have to take the small wins for what we can, just in terms of slowing down this project. We know that delay in a lot of ways is defeat, and so we're going to move forward with as much as we possibly can in terms of getting those small wins. Last thing I'll mention, Tulu, and I'll pass it right over to you, and Annika can get us started here. I just spoke with a colleague this morning. I was like, look, I'm going through this PowerPoint and seeing all the ways that we've supported some of this work and done what we can on the state and local level. One thing we have not done in a couple of years that we need to get back to is forcing the hand of Ascension Parish Council. That is the one council no one has been able to get on record. And so now I think that it's really important, especially with this public hearing, that we ask them to join us. We've created a link to basically say, okay, Ascension Parish resident, click this one thing, email your council person, let them know this hearing is happening. But we can certainly do a little bit more now that we know it's possible in a Livingston and a Tangipahoa. What does it look like to do it in Ascension too?
All right. Wow. That's fabulous. Thank you so much, Caitlin. Before I turn it over to Annika, on the economics of all of this, um, just for both you and Scott, like tell us what it's like the front end pollution fights with these facilities versus the back end infrastructure fights, right? Where the pipelines are going, where the injection wells will be. Is that new? Is this something that's you all are trying to get on top of from an organizing perspective? Is this new?
No, but it is very hard. Ascension Parish in particular sees itself as profiting from these new petrochemical plants. It is not only is it pro oil and gas, you have places like Plaquemines Parish in Louisiana that are pro oil and gas, but oil and gas has abandoned them, right? So the ways we talk about oil and gas, we can be more aggressive in a place like that. They think of themselves as an oil parish, but there ain't no more oil anymore. And the problem is all of these leaking wells that lead to deaths. So, but a place like Ascension Parish, I think they profit. Actually, Ascension Parish, Prairieville is a place where the mostly white petrochemical plant workers commute to after 5 o'clock. So the schools in Ascension Parish are well funded. They've their budgets look a lot better than other parishes. So it's a particularly tough to figure out what aspect of CCS to focus on in a parish like that. And you just have to give it up to Caitlin for it really is like if we, how Ascension Parish goes, that's how the United States goes.
Yeah.
So it's not new, but and it when we win, we're stopping petrochemical plants like Formosa that could emit 13 megatons of CO2 a year. So Ms. Sharon Levine in St. James herself is accomplishing carbon sequestration on the order of 13 injection projects. So, we don't win every fight in Louisiana, of course, but when we win, we are doing major benefits for the earth.
I didn't know if you wanted me to add anything, Lou, but I will plus everything that Scott said. And it definitely makes it more unique, right? We have to be really strategic in the way that we attack a lot of these arguments. I probably get on a daily when I'm knocking the door of someone in Ascension, particularly in Sorrento Burnside. They're walking outdoors in their Shell uniform or their Exxon uniform or what have you. And
Mm.
so these are folks that would normally be all for petrochemical build out or LNG build out, et cetera. But they are able to make the distinction between one, this is something where industry is willing to compromise and literally put it next to their homes, and that's a hard line in the sand for them. Like anywhere in an industrial or an area that's slated for industrial build out, sure, but not near my home. So that makes it a little easier. And then of course, like when you take a parish like Ascension, even though it is affluent, it is wealthy by majority, there's little pockets of very impoverished, very black areas. And you have to constantly bring that up for folks, right? Well, what about Donaldsonville? What about Modest? What about these parts of the parish that you've forgotten that has the failing schools, right? That has the people that can't get the jobs where the medium household income is $29,000 a year. And so we have to really bring those facts to people to help them say what Scott said, right? Like this idea that oil and gas still runs Louisiana and folks are seeing the benefit of investing in it for so many years and kind of this farce that is the oil and gas industry in Louisiana. You really can get a little further in conversation and educate people a little bit more when you bring up those facts.
hmm just a quick question on Livingston Parish. So Lake Maurepas is how many wells did they propose? Is it six in
6
an
for
eight
Livingston.
in an 8 foot right average depth of for Lake Maurepas? So I don't think
Eight foot depth lake. Yeah, the wells would go down to 8,000 feet or so. Yeah.
yeah. Um, so and I watched the footage of the hearing where the just the incredible outrage of the community, right? I guess I'm just, is this new? Is this like the additional infrastructure that they're putting into the white communities is it at a breaking point? What do you see on the ground in on that question?
Yeah, yes, it's new, right? I think folks were fine when it was in the predominantly Black areas, the poor
Right,
areas. The moment that it became, a problem for the guy that likes to go boating every weekend, the guy that gets to
right.
enjoy his family on the water, the retiree that's settling down on Lake Marapawn. We could name all the lakes and different wildlife management centers that also have this. But all that to say, now it's a problem, right? Now folks see industry for who they are, which are people that are willing to break up your lovely lifestyle if it means they can, meet the bottom dollar and make more money. And so it is definitely creating new unsuspecting allies in the fight. Of course, that comes with a lot of like uneducating and deconstructing and trying to help people work with folks that they necessarily would not work with. And it's certainly try to, at least at the very least, if we could get rid of like the NIMBYism terms or the way in which we organize around these facilities, to us, that's like a win in and of itself, right? Having these people that normally wouldn't work with people of color or work with Democrats, whatever, the list is long. I always laugh and say Mr. Bill Whittington, who's phenomenal. We have nothing in common except for the fact that we hate CCS and we vibe off of that. We speak often. I do as many meetings for him as possible and engage with his community members as much as he lets me. And so, as long as we can find that common ground, keep it respectful, and again, get rid of the NIMBYism, I'm sure that we can take down these fights, these multiple fights. Yeah.
All right. Uh, Thank you so much. Okay, Annika, I'm going to turn it over to you. Like the economics, the project finance, what are you seeing?
Yeah, let's look at that. Thank you. Hi, my name's Annika June. I'm an energy data analyst at the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis, or IEFA. And today I'll be shifting gears a little bit from the discussion that Scott and Caitlin provided. And I'll be talking about some of the federal tax credits that are actually driving this CCS build out. These credits are key financial tools that are underpinning the build out of the facilities, the pipelines, the storage wells involved in the CCS-based industry in the US. And without these credits, CCS-reliant projects would be too expensive to implement on the scale that we're seeing announced and in planning or development phases. Next slide. The federal subsidies are in the form of tax credits, and they are really enabling the CCS build out across the country. And the bulk of the projects that have been announced are located in the Gulf Coast region. That's Louisiana and Texas primarily. These subsidies are not environmental regulations, and they don't necessarily have goals of emissions reductions at all. They don't actually result in emissions benefits when projects are evaluated using realistic parameters of carbon capture rates and methane leakage rates, et cetera, on a full life cycle basis. I'll present a brief case study to illustrate the gap between the enormous burden on taxpayers for CCS-reliant projects and the paltry emissions benefit, even under ideal conditions. Under realistic conditions, the emissions are likely to be much higher, resulting in a perverse situation in which the federal government and us as taxpayers will be effectively paying companies to pollute. Next slide. There are two key tax credits established under the Inflation Reduction Act in 2022 that I want to highlight. The first is the 45V Clean Hydrogen Production Credit. It applies to fossil-based, so-called blue, and renewable energy-based, green, projects that are designed to produce hydrogen. The credit can also apply to facilities that produce hydrogen as an intermediate product, so an ammonia facility or a methanol production facility could also qualify for the 45V credit, even though hydrogen isn't the end product. The value of the credit is based on how clean the hydrogen is, which is the associated emissions generated for every kilogram of hydrogen made. The carbon intensity of a product is calculated to include emissions generated from the production of a feedstock, as well as the power used at a facility, all the way through to the point at which low-pressure hydrogen has been produced. This is called a cradle-to-gate life cycle envelope, but it emits all downstream emissions related to the compression and leakage of hydrogen that occurs in transport and storage, as well as any other emissions related to the final use of the products. The calculations have a number of built-in assumptions for key parameters that have been shown to be out of step with other current research, particularly in relation to upstream methane leakage rates in projects that are reliant on natural gas. The reconciliation bill that was passed this summer resulted in the cancellation of many of the programs in the IRA that were intended to spur the development and utilization of renewables and other low-carbon technologies. 45V was originally slated for cancellation. A last-minute change, though, saw the credit remain, but it now has a shortened deadline for eligibility. Projects must be under construction by December 2027 in order to qualify. And if projects are able to qualify for the credit, they'll be able to access it for 10 years. Next slide. 45Q, on the other hand, is really a credit that relates specifically to the amount of CO2 that's captured and controlled. It only applies to fossil-based or blue projects that have associated carbon emissions that need to be managed. The credit applies to a broad range of activities that can include carbon capture on petrochemical projects, power generation, and natural gas processing. So it isn't product specific the way 45V is. The value of the credit is based on how much carbon is captured and then utilized or stored. But the carbon intensity of the end product is irrelevant. It has no impact on the access to the credit at all. Under 45Q, there's no connection between dollars and carbon intensity, by which I mean the relative emissions benefit of producing these products with carbon capture compared to a product without carbon capture. The reconciliation bill saw the 45Q credit actually increase, making the credit value for utilization equal to that for storage. Previously, the 45Q credit privileged projects that involved permanent storage of carbon with a higher credit value versus utilization of the captured CO2. Now, even using the captured CO2 to extract more oil using enhanced oil recovery methods gives companies access to the same credit amount as storage. And this represents an additional profit opportunity for companies, as well as incentivizing more fossil fuel extraction, use, and resulting in associated emissions. Finally, the companies can access 45Q for 12 years rather than 10 as available under 45V. Next slide. For most projects that we're seeing proposed and under development in the Gulf Coast area, 45Q is the key to the economic case for incorporating and utilizing carbon capture and storage systems for these companies. 45V is really unlikely to be an economic driver, and that's for a couple of reasons. First, most fossil-based projects would not actually be able to meet the carbon intensity requirements for accessing the credit. Again, those requirements are based on a limited life cycle analysis. They don't include realistic assumptions about key inputs such as upstream methane leakage and carbon capture rates. But even with favorable carbon accounting, most fossil-based projects are just too dirty to qualify. And the hydrogen hype is waning. There was a lot of excitement around use of hydrogen for everything a few years ago, but over time that hype has died down because it's just really expensive to make, move, and store hydrogen. However, we have seen a shift to production of other low carbon fuels such as ammonia and methanol, which do depend on the production of hydrogen. Some projects in the region can qualify for the 45V credits. Blue methanol projects are some that could qualify on the basis of carbon intensity. And industry promotes blue methanol as a low carbon shipping fuel, which can be debated depending on how the carbon accounting is done. And I should point out here that the market for a lot of the products that are being proposed and developed for production in the Gulf Coast region are actually intended for international buyers. The shipping industry and overseas buyers of ammonia, they plan to use this ammonia as co-firing fuel in outdated coal-fired power plants. Next slide. For most projects that are using fuel and feedstock from fossil fuels, such as coal and natural gas, 45Q is actually more lucrative for companies. It provides more flexibility. Credits are based on how much carbon dioxide is captured and then used or stored. There are no carbon intensity targets to miss that could risk failure to capture the credit, as is the case under 45V. So 45Q really helps businesses develop these projects and justify to their investors that these projects will be profitable. 45Q allows a company to capture and control and store or use or sell as much CO2 as they can. And this means that if the equipment doesn't work as well as expected, if there are problems with the pipeline, if there are problems with the off-takers of the storage systems, or if some portion of the carbon management chain is not working, the company has a lot of wiggle room to continue to operate because they can still access as much 45Q credit as they can. Another key feature of the 45Q credit is that it's transferable. This means that if a company doesn't have sufficient tax liability that they can use themselves, these credits can be sold to a company that can use them, and there are currently markets available that allow them to do this. It's a way for a smaller company to generate more revenue by monetizing the credits that they are getting for the carbon capture and storage or utilization. Under the 45Q, there was this revision I mentioned that made the credit value of permanent storage and utilization equivalent. In practice, this will make it easier for companies to get all of the components of the carbon management chain working in concert and bring them online and function as a coordinated whole. There are often different operators that are running a facility, doing the carbon capture. There may be a different entity running the pipeline. There may be a third entity running the sequestration or offtake operation. By making the utilization and storage credit equal, as happened under the reconciliation bill, it gives operators even more flexibility to be able to go ahead and start capturing carbon, sell it, and then move it around. Maybe there's a class 6 well or a storage opportunity that is ready to go, or maybe not. Perhaps the captured CO2 Perhaps the captured CO2 needs to go to enhanced oil recovery because there are existing wells, and the storage wells are not yet permitted or operational. The change in credit value gives operators a little bit more flexibility so they can promise to their shareholders or investors, okay, we're going to be able to come online, we're going to be able to capture this CO2, we're going to be able to move it around, we're going to be able to put it somewhere, and we're going to be able to access the 45Q credits. So all of this adds up to be a great boon for companies, making it as easy as possible, as lucrative as possible for them to develop these carbon capture projects. Next slide, please. So I'll take a little bit of time here to talk about how much money is at stake when I'm talking about 45Q credits. And I'll walk through the example of the Air Products project that both Caitlin and Scott referred to. This is a new facility that's currently estimated to cost about $7 billion, up from their original estimate of $4.5 billion. And the idea is to use methane, or natural gas, feedstock to produce about 600,000 tons of hydrogen a year. Some of that hydrogen will be converted to ammonia or possibly methanol. It's unclear. The current plan is for this facility to be online in 2028, and the company promises to capture 95% of the carbon dioxide from the autothermal reforming unit of the facility. Note that this means the company is promising to capture emissions from a single flow of exhaust gas only. The 95% promise does not include any other emissions related to the production of hydrogen, including the operation of the carbon capture equipment itself. Air Products claims it will capture about 5 million metric tons of CO2 annually, and that would be stored in the location in Lake Maurepas that Scott was discussing. Next slide. Assuming Air Products is able to capture and control and store or utilize all that CO2 every year for the 12 years of 45Q eligibility, it will rake in about $6.3 billion. That's almost as much as it would cost to build the entire plant. And this doesn't even include the profit that they would get from selling the hydrogen that they're producing. It's only the value of the credit that would come from taxpayers like us. But even at a lower capture rate of 60%, the company could still pull in $4 billion over the 12 years. At that rate, the company would be 35 percentage points below the promised emissions reduction target that they set, but there's no penalty or consequence. Air Products would collect billions of dollars because the 45Q credit is not tied to carbon intensity or emissions reductions. It's only connected to the capture and control of carbon. Next slide. And as the blue bars show on the right, the project is likely to generate tens of millions of tons of new emissions during that same 12-year time frame. Because the carbon capture technology is only affixed to a single flue at a single portion of the facility, all of the other emissions related to the production and transport of the fuel and feedstock, the operation of the facility, including the carbon capture equipment itself, and any downstream emissions related to transport, storage, leakage, and use are not part of the promised 95% capture rate. There are a lot of unmitigated emissions related to the operation of a plant such as this one. The promise of using hydrogen as a fuel or feedstock is that the emissions related to using a fossil fuel will be captured and controlled at the point of production. If we assume that the resulting hydrogen has an overall benefit by replacing more emissions-intense fuels, we can calculate whether or not there's a net benefit to producing this product. What we find when we make very favorable assumptions, very high capture rates, very low methane leakage rates, we can see that over the 12 years, this project that would be accessing 45Q, there is a minimal emissions benefit. That's what that little yellow block is. That's the minimal emissions benefit of just 2 million metric tons, but that's over 12 years. By way of comparison, 2 million metric tons is about 1/8 of the annual emissions from the dirtiest coal plant in the United States. Even assuming very favorable figures for the emissions reductions that are promised at this facility, it is extremely modest. And for those 2 million metric tons over 12 years, US taxpayers would be providing Air Products $6.3 billion. In the worst case scenario for upstream methane leakage, even assuming very high carbon capture rates, 33.1 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent would be added to the atmosphere. This is double the emissions from the US's dirtiest coal plant. And at lower carbon capture rates, the emissions levels soar. Next slide. So considering these tax credits and how they're impacting the development and build out of CCS-dependent infrastructure and industry in the Gulf South and elsewhere in the US, it's important that the true climate impact of the production be evaluated on a net basis and cover the full life cycle rather than limiting the life cycle analysis to a cradle-to-grate envelope or a specific facility or just a single exhaust flue at the facility. As illustrated by the Air Products example, it can be seen that fossil hydrogen with carbon capture is an expensive distraction that won't result in emissions benefits. If we do true carbon accounting with a full cradle-to-grave life cycle envelope, we can see the emissions benefits are just not there. Even if they are, the savings are so small compared to the massive taxpayer investment in these facilities that we need to question whether or not this is money well spent. Taken together, we can see that tax-based programs are poor tools for environmental regulation. 45Q in particular does not tie access to the credit with overall reductions in greenhouse gases for the projects that are being proposed. There's no relationship between reduction in emissions or low carbon intensity, so it makes it difficult for us to say that these investments make sense in terms of meeting a goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions or creating truly low carbon products. Finally, programs like 45V and 45Q have the potential to provide billions in subsidies to the fossil fuel industry without supporting the achievement of any climate benefit at all. These credit programs are uncapped, meaning there's no limit to how much money can be acquired or claimed by companies. Next slide. I look forward to any questions, and I'll turn it back to Taylor and Lou to facilitate the Q&A portion of the webinar.
Thank you so much, Annika. So I guess the question I have, like when you're talking about blue ammonia, right, or blue hydrogen, like don't from the industry experts that you deal with every day, like if there is going to be more ammonia, right, production, what do you say when they put to you the question, well, why not have CCUS as part of that? And it's a better form of ammonia production than we had in the
Right.
past.
At least we're capturing some of the CO2 is the argument, right?
Yeah.
Well, to that, I would say, well, what is the planned end use of that particular product?
Right.
Industry likes to say that, the end use, they like to talk about all of the possible end uses of ammonia, for example. But when we look at these projects that are planned for the Gulf Coast area, we see that a lot of that production is actually intended for customers that are overseas. And they're not using it in many cases for fertilizer. They're actually using it as a fuel to co-fire in their coal-fired power plants so that they can reduce their local emissions because there's no carbon in ammonia. But the problem here that we would say, well, if the problem is power generation, say in Japan or Korea, we would advocate for the introduction of renewables and batteries and other systems to generate and maintain power structures rather than invest in these fossil-based sort of temporary or poor solutions. They're not good solutions economically because they rely on huge tax credits. They're not good solutions in terms of environment. They're developing systems where we're going to be transporting enormous volumes of very toxic ammonia across the ocean. So we would just advocate for finding a better solution to that end problem, which is power generation and maintaining power on the grid. But we would also advocate for, if there is a project that is going to be, say, a retrofit on an existing facility, to maybe there is an argument for retrofitting an existing ammonia facility to capture some of the carbon, control it, produce a lower carbon product to replace an unabated product. Maybe there is some benefit there. But I think even in that, the accounting might show that the massive investment required to do that might argue for a different type of solution. But since the 45Q subsidizes these projects, it's distorting the economics that these companies are evaluating when they're looking at these projects.
Right. Caitlin, what do you hear about blue ammonia and jobs and all of that on the ground? What do you think?
Yeah, I think people are like I said earlier, when you have the conversation with folks and you point to the facts, they are open to it. And in fact, like our numbers are so, for lack of a better term, terrible in terms of the amount of jobs that would be coming to that community. So whenever you present a number of 30 or 50, which seems to be kind of what a lot of the carbon capture and storage plants have stated they would like to hire in the area, and then you say, okay, well, is that even local hire? Folks are then kind of riled up and are just like, you're right, like they're not even required to hire us. If we are, qualified for the job is another question. And so folks are not really driven. It's not like we're talking about hundreds or thousands of jobs, and even the like 100 or so folks that come in for construction, that is not necessarily local hire either, and that really drives people.
Yeah. All right. Scott, any comment further on the jobs piece or what you're hearing on the ground, or we
Oh
can turn it
yeah,
over to Taylor for some questions.
I put a link in the chat. I mean, it's kind of a known thing, and now we have a little bit of data analysis about who's hired by the oil industry.
Right.
They don't do DEI surveys at Exxon, right? But I mean, we know they don't necessarily hire. They just definitely don't hire African American folks in the proportions that we live and exist in Louisiana. And then if Black folks do get a job, maybe they're not a full employee, they're probably the contractor. This study did get one of our Tulane researchers fired, but it is commonly known, and most of the jobs are in the temporary construction. These plants are fabricated in South America, like the big distillation columns are welded in Chile, and they're usually barged into the Mississippi River, and they're just assembled in Ascension Parish or Plaquemines, and generally that assembly, all of the southern part of the continent is a migrant workforce. So if you go to one of these construction sites, the license plates say Tennessee, Texas. There's a lot of folks from Guadalajara. It's definitely un equipo, un meta. So I mean, we have a migrant labor force across the southern part of the continent that builds these. So, and our governor is a labor broker for those construction firms. So, yeah, Louisiana is one of the poorest states, despite these billions of dollars flowing through our state, because we don't get the jobs. The economic benefits are not localized.
Got it. Absolutely. All right. Taylor, I'll turn it over to you to moderate some questions.
Yeah, definitely. One of the questions that came in is, are there any requirements currently on the books to plug old wells before drilling new ones for CCS? And if you know if these rules vary from state to state.
No, we had hoped, so it all comes down to the Louisiana Department's discretion on how far away from the injection well are they looking for effects. And so you may have heard of Petronova as an enhanced oil recovery CO2 site. They established a maximum monitoring area. That is to say, how far does this plume extend under the earth of 5 miles? And they require the applicant to look after that and make sure nothing goes wrong. But even they're not required to plug the wells. And we were hopeful in the beginning that these class 6 applications would have requirements to plug wells. I think there's a lot of people in Baton Rouge who still hope for that, but we've seen the Black Lake project be permitted without those requirements, even though I'll hear from Exxon that, you know, that seems bad to them. And it just is, I've heard from industry people that, well, the Black Lake project will proceed and they will likely run into issues. So I think you see this across the United States. We're not very preventative. We wait until something happens. And it seems like that's why we were opposed to Louisiana getting primacy over the permitting process of these wells. And it seems like it's going to be the residents around Black Lake who report and bring these problems up. And then after there's a problem, we'll plug the well, probably.
Yeah, thank you for that. And then there's another question. This one's for you, Caitlin. If you could explain the concept of police juries and like what power they have. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you're familiar with the state of Louisiana, we have what's called police juries. They're similar to local governing bodies like parish councils or city councils. And I did see that question in the chat. And like not to like completely obliterate the power that they have, but it is kind of honestly symbolic, right? So like they reversed, perfect example, the Vernon Parish Police Jury. I'm sure that's what you're referring to, Mr. Peter, who put it in the chat, I think. Essentially they reversed resolutions, basically saying that they were in support of the carbon capture and storage build out in their parish or their district. It doesn't mean that they have any regulatory power whatsoever. It's just essentially saying like this parish wants this for our parish, right? And our folks, they're completely like not taking into account that folks have come out by the masses to say that they don't want this, but their parish police juror is in support of carbon capture and storage there. So yeah.
That's helpful. Great. Thank you.
No problem.
And then another question, are there subsidies at the state level for CCS? And if so, how do they compare to 45Q?
Yeah, I can jump in a little bit and Scott and Caitlin, you might have more to add that's specific to Louisiana. Louisiana is a very favorable pro-industry, fossil fuel development state and has a number of incentives at the state and county or parish level. And this is true in a lot of states that they're not credits in the same way that the 45Q is a credit. They might be, favorable property tax provisions, or, there might be state or local authority around certain permitting or taxation regimes that make it more favorable to attract businesses to their area. So in Texas, their counties are often offering really favorable tax opportunities to companies in order to entice them to locate in their counties. But it's not exactly the same mechanism as 45Q. It's not a straight up tax credit for a company that's filing taxes.
Yeah, I can agree with that. And Scott, feel free to add. We still have a very robust industrial tax exemption program that every industry takes advantage of. A lot of the carbon capture and storage facilities, proposed facilities that is, have already tried to take advantage of it. If they have not, it's in the queue. And our parish councils pretty much don't have the purview over that. There's a special board that does now, but our governor, Jeff Landry, gets the last say so. And ultimately, I mean, he's going to vote the way that we know that he's going to vote. So essentially, like Annika stated, not exactly a tax credit, but a tax exemption, right?
Yeah, I think Louisiana economic development is neither Louisiana nor economic development. It's a sugar plantation sales marketing campaign. And unfortunately, they often leave out the wetlands, and they leave out that sugar plantations have historic value for the United States and telling of how the United States became wealthy. So we're often following that LED tax credit as, you know, before we see, you know, probably 8 months before we see a wetlands permit, we see the decision at the state level to exempt the sugarcane plantation acquisition and exempt the property taxes up to 80% from the ITEP program. So it's something we really sell the farm in Louisiana. We sell it over and over again to China and Saudi Arabia and Taiwan.
All right. So what do you, just last word from all of you before we need to transition to our next meetings. The climate politics around CCUS, like what do you all feel is the direction of this debate? And is the subsidy enough to keep CCUS alive at this point?
Is the subsidy enough? I think it's enough to keep it. I mean, they're gonna try, right? They mean industry. Like if they can take advantage of the subsidy, they most certainly will do that. Do I think that they will be able to do it easily? And do I think they'll be able to do it everywhere in the state like they thought they would? No. I think some communities will be very successful in stopping, particularly the ones that are just staunch. I'm talking in the 70-80% range in opposition of the carbon capture and storage build out. For those that kind of like teeter on the lines, you've got some that are for it, don't really understand it, and not willing to get behind any environmental groups to stop it, and then you've got some that are just like full on in. I think the divided communities probably we will be much more harder for us to be able to stop in those areas, but for those like in central Louisiana, et cetera, especially because they've been so successful and like even getting Jeff to, you know, tick off industry in this moratorium. For what it's worth, he did send them a message that they don't love, and they're already responding to it in a really big way. And so I'm interested to see. I'm here for the ride, right? Like do whatever I can to support the communities, all of them that want to stop carbon capture and storage. But I most certainly think some will be successful, and we'll do whatever we can to make sure that at least everyone has a voice and a say so at the table.
Indeed.
Yeah, I'll add that that the tax credit is really generous, and I mean it's pretty darn flexible. It's very favorable to industry, but I'll also say that it's not really quite enough.
Right.
That companies really they need to find buyers for these low carbon products. They need to develop these offtake contracts. A lot of projects are really struggling to get those offtake contracts that they need in order to get their investment. So there are a lot of proposals, there are a lot of ideas out there, but the math, the economics of it, the financial component is still a little bit tricky, even with the big tax credit. The big risk on the horizon is that the fossil fuel industry has a lot of sway with the current administration and could press the administration to either extend the length of the tax credit or increase it further. And industry has been talking about that for a long time. They've already been priming that idea. They want it pushed up to $120 for storage and utilization. They want it pushed up even higher and higher and higher because the math often doesn't make sense for some of these facilities, particularly those in the Gulf Coast region. When we're talking about ethanol in the Midwest, the math is a little bit different. But in the Gulf Coast, it's it's still a little bit tricky. And so, you know, are the credits enough to keep the ecosystem afloat? No. So how that gets resolved, I'm not sure, but
Yeah,
Yeah.
watch Exxon.
there are
Yeah,
questions.
yeah,
Yeah.
watch Exxon. You know, when this was first announced, they leased 1 million acres of the Gulf, and they keep those leases 1 million acres. That's more than the marine, you know, protected areas of the entire country. Exxon has leased for this technology. But, you know, and in 2022, Exxon said, we're injecting in Vermilion Parish because they own 11% of Vermilion Parish. So I think when this was first announced, it's a real estate question, right? You have companies that own pore space and trying to figure out something to do with it. So it's a solution, looking for a problem, you know. But and as I think this maintenance issue, okay, you could inject in Vermilion Parish again, but what does your maintenance cost on the project look like in year 10? It's insanely high because the Gulf of Mexico is coming for you. The salt water and 8 feet of storm surge is not, you know, your costs are going to go up. So I think we've seen Exxon retreat from the ocean, and also the new approvals, unfortunately in Texas, they're very close to the existing pipeline. So they are even with the existing levels, which are really high, we've seen Exxon move from a high capital expenditure plan in the ocean, which they could still do if the credits are increased, to a much lower capital expenditure plan where they're leveraging the existing CO2 pipeline and not building big pipelines and just planning injection sites, you know, 5 miles off of that main
Yeah.
line. So I think
Yeah.
it's evolving, and I think that maintenance cost issue is something I bring up to applicants and again because I think they're not thinking about it.
Yeah. Yeah, we didn't really get into the offshore build out, did we? Um, but I didn't know that Exxon had leased that many acres of potential CCUS storage offshore. Um, all right, Taylor, I I think we're going to wrap things up. I want to say thank you to all of you who have participated for your great questions, and we're going to sign off. I hope you all are energized and educated by our conversation today. It's an amazing fight, and it's been great to have Caitlin and Scott and Annika here with us. Truly the dream team of experts on CCUS in the Gulf South. So thank you so much, and have a great day, all of you.
You.
Thank you.